Hello everyone, today we talk about mysticism, asceticism, millenarism in the context of the Gregorian reforms or as a consequence or even a reaction to them. But mostly actually in a recomposing let's say relation with it, given the broader expansion of the papal spiritual authority in Europe, and let's say the ultimate success in the effort of catalyzation and channeling of the various reform instances, all the various spiritual needs and questions and issues broadly meant. Because from one side, yes, we see that the Gregorian reforms brought to the creation of a papal monarchy, and that the clerical prevalence over the secular element within the church administration, and of course, but also more broadly in many temporal affairs, especially in certain areas of Europe, but comprehensively, expanding further and becoming rather homogeneous in that sense, independently from the, let's say, the actual control that Rome could have in the most peripheral centers, but overall as a real universal power at the peak of, by the 13th century, was actually accompanied by, unequivocally by a push towards the spiritual rigorism and asceticism. Right, this happened within the same church, so it's not just a powerful temporal entity, right, devoid of any kind of moral scruple and just the terrible picture that whoever has criticized the church ever since has more or less carried on mostly on the same basis, on the same level of criticism. And that here we make a story that is not just about the church in itself, but what impact this had in the development of civilization. And from one side, we don't actually hide anything of the issues of the church. We still have to look at the late medieval conciliarism, the schisms actually, because there were more than once, not just the major one, but and all those instances of church reform that came back over time. But at the same time, we cannot deny the reality in the form of a different dimension that the church had compared to any other temporal power at the time. Right? No power can't be temporal in a dimension, but at the same time, this was power like no other, and it had to cope with this situation also because, of course, of these criticism that was always directed at it, and on a deep base. It was not just on the ethical level. The clergy was rich, right? The clergy was rich even before the reform. Everybody was fine with that, right? This was about the fact that the papacy claimed certain temporal prerogatives that were fundamentally aiming at passing by the same imperial authority and actually controlling it directly, and that was the real issue, right? But it's obvious that at a popular level, even within the same church, there were many other currents, debates, views, etc. That it's also remarkable how the church, in fact, managed to contain within itself, to accept it, sometimes to integrate it even from heterodoxy. So we'll have to make other videos to see this, and that's why fundamentally this is so important. So the great way of movements that witnessed this phenomenon flourished, in fact, between the 11th and the 13th century. So the moment of major expansion, not just of church power, but also the same medieval civilization overall, right? So this would have happened independently from a church reformation, even though, of course, the things were strictly intertwined historically, but it was obvious, as we've seen recently when we're talking about the Cathars once again, that there were simply new ideas that, let's say, seemed new at the time, that had already been proposed back in the day, in late antiquity, when Christianity came to be legal eventually, the state religion, that were kind of revolving even in there around the same problems, one or another, with universal issues that are universal not within just the boundary of the church, but properly are universal in the attitude that especially the fringe usually has towards the church, towards orthodoxy in general, beyond this historical context, and that we have explained and in the many heresies that had mostly all a kind of agnostic background, right? So they were quite specifically oriented towards a very precise philosophical and cosmological idea that was fundamentally, if not anti-civilizational, however, were aiming at tearing down most of what was created. And again, as we've seen, these were fundamentally extremistic movements, quite violent and aggressive ones, that risked to make the same church collapse at a point, but that not only had some disadvantage merely in the same extremistic purpose, but also properly were failing at a scientific and moral interpretation of the world for the majority to work with. And so that's the reason why ultimately this enormous waves of expansion were they ordered themselves on kind of a more scientific, rational ground, because with scholastic and so on, because this wasn't just about the church that made indeed an enormous work of civilization, of culture, of law, of administration, and so on, and worked for a real recomposition and cohesion of the West and Western Christendom, and also expanding it forward dramatically. But that were supported by the rest of society, by the secular world, because without that, there was no way for the church or the same secular world to evolve in the way they did. And that's why also the investiture controversy was never about delegitimizing the actual universal authority as such, right? But just, in fact, criticizing the fitness of the individuals that covered those offices. And it's kind of obvious, and it's no surprise that the radical rejection of these universal powers occurred at a time where universalism was collapsing. In a moment of new crisis, in a moment of new, essentially disorientation that brought to new systems to evolve, but not with the same reach that these ones had clamorously had in the absence of a state. Let's stress this thing that at least states always existed. You can even argue that a tribe has some kind of statal consistency, but I mean, in terms of modernistic terms, like you don't do what the papas in the empire were able to do, in spite of all the difficulties that also created to each other, if you're not really making a work of civilization on actual universal basis, right? And much of what we inherit as a medieval legacy, in fact, stems from this, because medieval civilization lived on even after the crisis, and we basically built on the same branch. Let's say that say our civilization is, as a modern one, is grafted properly on the medieval one. It was not a point in which this was demolished and recreated on another base like antiquity. So it's extremely relevant today to talk even about these movements. For example, during the years of the investiture controversy, new monastic orders had been born, and these were provided with were endowed with a special contemplative charge, let's say, such as the Camaldolaes, the Carthusians, that had essentially made the Westerners rediscover that hermitism that up to that point had been, let's say at least more specifically, a patrimony of the East, where this had been born in the first place, of the early monasticism in the first centuries of Christendom, but also, well, the same Bible, the same Gospels, presenting very clear examples. And in reality, these were not real monastic orders per se, right? Because at that time, there was no other order outside the Benedictine one, right? So these were called rather congregations. So being a monk in the West equated totally to be a Benedictine, right? Nobody thought outside that mindset, right? Not even later, let's say, with the creation of other properly other orders, right? It was ever an end to the idea of Saint Benedict as patron of Europe, and say the example of Western monasticism. These were congregations, which also gives you the idea of how, of course, by the 11th to 12th century, right, most of these movements were spontaneous, couldn't really quite be controlled, just like the heterodox and the more even the heretical ones were spreading with a control that was increased, right? It was created from scratch. You can argue together with the same papal monarchy over the centuries. And however, also the principal, say, mystical temper of the Reformation, that was the Camaldolese Pier Damiani, had realized that the principle of prevalence of spirit over matter was translated, let's say, in the environments that were, gravitated around the reforming popes, in the prevalence of the clergy on the laymen. So they had realized that, of course, the temporal power of the church was something that could not quite bring to kind of just, the church, all the ecclesiastical hierarchy giving up any temporal office, going, like a hermit in a way. And this is important because the St. Gregorian reforms had been supported significantly by these ascetic figures that sometimes were actually also being both things, right? Both, even cardinals, but say monks and hermits properly meant. And so this provides you also with the degree of experimentalism and, experience that that these figures were gathering in their world, in their life. And the realization of the need of a temporal power is kind of obvious, as we were saying before, but it's also interesting to see how, the Hermetism was, let's say, still in parallel to the two things. This is very important because historically, when you look at even in the first monastic movements in Western Europe, think about the Lorrain experiment, and the connection that those monks, for example, had with the episcopal offices of the great cities of Provence. So we're talking about actually the cultural heart of Western Europe by the 5th century. You realize that it was kind of normal, and that there should have not been really a barrier in this regard between a monastic experience and an episcopal one, right? So the secular clergy, could be trained spiritually also by living in different. But then eventually during the Middle Ages, there is, let's say, especially in the, at this point, properly in the High Middle Ages, there is newly this split, this diversification, of which the Gregorian form is the same expression. I mean, the idea that, of course, what is this church now that things are re-expanding dramatically? We have to start controlling the community of faithful and regulated, and make such that they conform, they're correctly following the biblical teaching, and that this goes towards a healthy, positive, cooperative direction. Well, there were many ideas, as we've seen, and so a bit of the stereotype of the monk as the heretic, let's say, by excess, and as the secular clergyman as the truly, the man of the world that knows his deal, in this sense, in a political and social, but also military sense, is, it's been somewhat dichotomically opposed, but even if it wasn't all the same thing. There were ferocious debates about this, but it's at that point, in considering that the church maintained its unity, it seems like more of a force, right, of a system that is able to have this radically intense dialogue within itself and still remaining one thing, right? And so, as we were saying on that video on Caterism, also the fact that the actually heretical movements were hopelessly out of the system because they kind of put themselves out of that, right? Even the most heterodox fringes that at some point were also kind of at some point properly deemed as heretical, etc. But they had a different attitude from that further excess, and kind of cooperated, sometimes properly survived, right, and also reconciled with the church sometimes, historically, right, in more recent times and so on. So that's in my opinion a very important acknowledgement of the human capacities to make things work in an effective way and solving problems, because at the end of the day that's what civilization is about. And so this mystical figures reacted, however, to the disappointment of the overexpansion of the temporal power of the church, because some of them literally believed that that Christianity had to be, to provide at least with a radical, extremistic example. Like the ideal would have been literally Christ's emulation in lifestyle, in everything, right? And so that is not even properly the meaning, say the literal, right, meaning of the Gospels in a sense, and nor it is properly when it comes to how you have to cope with the world, because that is left onto you. That is your duty. Creation has been entrusted to you. It's not just a matter of let's say unhinging yourself from the world, right? Like a hermit would do. A monk wouldn't, because still the monastic ideal was of course an enclosed one within the monastery, but the monastery had to be visible to the world, right? It had to essentially reflect the perfection of heavenly Jerusalem and on earth, and as such, making the world a monastery. So the monastic lifestyle was meant to theory extend to everybody, but it was utopistic in nature. But there were some of those who wouldn't give up, would feel simply that they had to follow that mystical path, and their reaction is quite interesting, because they as we've seen, there was somebody that took completely a different direction for many reasons, and it wasn't just about a mystical push at all. It was something more political in nature. We've seen it with the Batarians, we've seen it with the actual heretics, like the Caters. But these more intransigent spirits that would have liked to see a completely different church still, largely, submitted wholly to the new church. This is also important. Nobody here was actually pretending that the church didn't have to exist, or that the Roman one specifically was not endowed with that charisma and primacy of charity, and that it was the universal one. It was, at this point, the reforms were succeeding, also because they they may have not happened, but it's not that they came out of the blue, right? Rome had that preeminence since ever, fundamentally, in the West. on a moral level, and even beyond, right? And so think about the relations with Constantinople and so on. But so there was no way, like that church was seen, the Roman Church was seen as in a totalizing way. So for a good Christian, independently from this reaction, from this protest, fundamentally, there was no way but still following the magisterium of the church. And this is also another great lesson in civilization, because the same Bible, after all, is quite that Christianity has fundamentally a positive bias towards authority. I mean, the secular one, right? It says, yes, that's something separate from your spiritual dimension, but you still live in the world, and as such, better things are where you don't create too many problems, right? And even when you have to, because of reasons of faith, of conscience, always mind secular authority as well. And again, this also in the recognition of the necessity of an empire that even in here was not being denied at all. And it would have been impossible to a completely maniacal, nonsense of no kind of possible logic in those times and places. It's a great capacity of seeing, there should be those who have to take care of that aspect as well, and that the church should guide, right, and to defend the Christian community, the church as a whole. Yet, after the submission, the mystics accentuated their tendency to escape the world, right? So this escape was not a desertion in meaning. It was, on the contrary, was an attempt to aggress, starting exactly from within the most intimate, inner part of the church, the forces that tied the same clergy to the earth, to the pleasures of life. So it was a matter of winning oneself, right? As always, as Christ in the desert, in fact. And so the hermetic connection and the struggle against Satan is exactly referred there as a model, right? So dominating your body, your passions. So something very old. This goes beyond saying Christianity. It's a realization that many, you can argue all cultures kind of reached to in a way or another, right? Don't think that this is, however, a universal thing within the same, meaning that every culture has these movements, as many as the more temporal ones, let's say. So it's not much a matter of cultural color, let's say, but rather of, I would say, the personal inclination of the individual from one side, but also in this sense, this different balance in what's the situation in terms of factual power, in spiritual dimension, and so on. This thing existed also in Islam, in other cultures were close to Christianity, in place, etc. And this was the sense and the message of a new religious order that, inspiring itself fundamentally to the monastic rule of Benedict of Nursia, essentially harshened and radicalized its message, right? This movement was born in the desert, which in Latin it's not the desert as the climatological areas that we know. The desert is literally where there is nothing, right, in terms properly of population, inhabitants. So in the West, actually, so it's the desertum, right, or at least, in the Eastern Fathers, that was very often literally the desert, considering the Near Eastern Egyptian, areas where this is mostly developed, also in etc. In the West, the desert was the forest, right? So we see these places all across Western Europe where, all over Europe, where historically also, in fact, the same Benedictines had started this since an early age. People took literally, the path from the most desolated areas, right? There is an hagiographic literature that is very worth reading, especially the early medieval one is extremely rich in meaning on the base of properly the clash with, the superimposition and the substitution to, and the fixing of pagan mentality in this integrative sense. And we made a video about Saint Aquistius, for example, albeit that was still meaningfully a creation of Pope Gregory the Great, that was understanding, albeit coming from one of the most powerfully temporal and secular, not just ecclesiastical backgrounds, but literally, familiar ones, that in order to win over the countryside, the demographic force of Europe at that point was not the late antique city anymore, right? That the countryside mattered, the peasants mattered, and so also the people who lived in these deserts, as they called them, and they had to be reached, and they were important to reach, to offer security, a comfort, etc. So going back to our High Middle Ages, we're talking about, for example, the Burgundian center, Citeaux, for example, that from this place, as a monastic order, took to the one of Cistercian, the name of Cistercian. Its program can be read in the Carta Caritatis of 1119. So this stated the absolute fealty to the Benedictine rule of the ora et labora, so pray and work. And this is what Western Christendom is being based on. Christian principles since Saint Benedict, the idea is you have to pray and work at the same time. So it already stresses something that it existed also in the Eastern Christendom, but the ascetic dimension there took sometimes more radical and extremistic characters, or at least more mystical ones. But aside from this, so this assiduous prayer, right, and very hard manual labor. So we're talking about literally something that made our civilization in the process of deforestation, in putting to cultivation of, in fact, uncultivated ground, the building of great churches. The Cistercian movement was orientated in an analogous way, albeit also in a sense in an opposition towards the powerful order of Cluny. Then had embodied a little bit that, albeit it still was a Benedictine order that was meant to kind of, come back to the old order of the rule of the uniformation. It was stemming essentially from the reform of the post-Carolingian times. It was kind of aristocratic, right? It tended to privilege the liturgical service, the more rich, let's say, paraphernalia, the apparatus, let's say, was heavily criticized, right? And so it had been one of the targets of the Reformation, because these people were the best embodiment of, in fact, the mirroring of the aristocratic character of their members, in the monastic dimension. So, in opposition to this, to the rich Cluniacs with the wide and very black caps, the Cistercians wore poor caps of rough cloth, non-colored one. They worked very hard. They used also, they contributed importantly to that time, science and technology. They used mechanical apparatuses such as the water mills, the fuller mills for the working of the clothes. They built, right, always in isolated places, but still big and wide abbeys, absolutely devoid, according to the will of the great mystic of the order, was Bernard of Clairvaux, of embellishments. So no sculptures, no paintings, nor multicolored glass windows and so on. So the purity and the lines of the light that filters also from the nude, the crude, say, windows without colors, is the symbol of the Cistercian will to follow in absolute poverty the Benedictine line, right? At least properly praying and working without any other distraction. And characteristic of the Cistercians is also thus that of an order following absolute poverty, right, and informed of a mystical vision of religious life. But that, for this reason, it did not close itself in a sort of contemplative immobilism. As we've seen, on the contrary, the Cistercians were workers, clearers, colonizers, and so in this sense, the Cistercian order was developed, not surprisingly, in that 12th century that saw all over Europe a great demographic and economical elan that the Saint Cistercians, in fact, kept, contributed to, right, even to the crusade, like horse breeding. The Cistercians had a very big impact in the process. And this started, also unsurprising, from the center of France, with the great abbeys of Citeaux, of Clairvaux. But the order spread naturally all over Europe, from Galicia to eastern Germany, from the Scandinavian peninsula to Sicily. In Italy, especially, two abbeys had great importance. One of Casamare and of Fossanova. So you can argue that Cistercians put at work the whole Europe through this system. What is fascinating also about this is that it's the way Western Christendom was declined in this regard, because this was still a moment in which Neoplatonism was fundamentally the primary philosophical model in the West, and yet there was a very practical, pragmatic, material dimension that always accompanied the West regarding to this. So, as we were saying before, yes, a mystical push, but never one that lost, track of the civilizational development properly as a rejection of the world broadly meant, right? Hermitism was important. It remained relatively, contained, albeit, revered and admired, but also sometimes creating some, problem to orthodoxy, as we will see. This was normal because still, as we've seen, the 12th century was the spread of the great heresies that, again, had not to do mainly with Hermitism at all. It was, minority phenomenon, but still, it was easy for the things to get mixed up given that scenario. I presume this is very important, as also the creation of the mendicant orders later on would be still framed within scholastic, and so mostly a rational, Aristotelian, scientific-oriented address, not a Neoplatonic, mystical, ascetical one, that the Church actually, from there on, was extremely careful to, and probably ever since the beginning, was very careful to control, and that's also why the original antagonism you can find also in the Byzantine Empire between, in fact, the secular clergy and the monks was quite radical, right? There also heresy spread among the Bogomils, everything, so on. In a monastic sense, there were always the least orthodox, and but in any case, that's a completely different thing for now. And yet, there, in fact, the difference was somewhat sharper than in the West. And the main, let's say, expression of the Cistercian monasticism was the Burgundian of noble origins, Bernard of Clairvaux, 1090-1153. We've seen him here and there. We're talking about the Reform, even architecture, to which he expressed some important theological and aesthetical opinions. As we've seen, the Cistercians had also in properly in appearance an important model to spread, even in our military historical interests, given that he wrote the De Laude Nove Militiae, who had a role that went beyond secular warfare and was a model for all those who wanted to fight, for Christ in order to defend Christendom. And there was a response, in a sense, also to those spiritual concerns of those who felt kind of out of place, even in their military role in a society that was, ever more tumultuous and without a firm orientation like the one of the 12th. I mean, that's quite important to properly see what's your motivation, militarily speaking. Who are you fighting for and what? Right. So these individuals were providing with answers, with models, with proposals, with that also were fundamentally just also, besides other more direct, independent, autonomous experiences, and they had a universal, all-encompassing purpose. So they were a reason of fate that eventually would be declined according to to the feeling, to the experience. And so that's why that's also what we lack, unfortunately, in documentation, largely from the bottom of society, like to understand what was concretely happening in some contexts. We don't have many of the voices of those people, aside from the monastic ones. In any case, Bernard of Clairvaux fought harshly against heresies, as much as against the mundanity of the clergy and all those innovating aspects of life of the time that seemed to him to threaten the primacy of spirit over the flesh. And this included culture that was spreading in city schools, wealth, right? That with the greater circulation of money was modifying the way of life of great part of the urban centers, right? And this aspect is somewhat relatively negative. I mean, nobody doubts there were risks that were perceived, were expressed at the time. As we've seen, that lay culture and this kind of promise of money that would simply improve your life without spiritual guidance was of legitimate concern. But exactly for that reason, Neoplatonism and asceticism and mysticism couldn't be the answer, right? It had to be, in fact, what the scholastic would do, as we were saying before, a more scientific, rational answer to allow the faithful to experience that important capacity, because what our lay culture, modernity state, the recovery of law, transactions is at the base of our state building, of something that provided more order, that put an end, if you want, to that same lack of regulation that was legitimately seen also in secular terms as an issue, right? And that yet this phase of let's say this part at least of spiritual experiences, this more mystical side, were perhaps not quite getting at the time. In fact, Bernard of Clairvaux' idea was a Christian society that would depreciate the world in order to aim at heaven, guided by a pure church, right? A pure, poor church, disciplined follower of the Roman Pope, and also a perfectly hierarchical one, right? So an ideal that was somewhat abstracted from reality, meaning what do you need a hierarchy for if you present that the system can be fully mystical, right, and not actually oriented to the world, right? That Of course, that has to represent some kind of divine superiority, but what's the role? What's the role of the hierarchy, right? If there is not properly even a material wealth on which you can provide for a new discipline and exercise it. So these were the incoherences in a sense of a system that was inspired just to kind of ascetical ideals, and that was producing at the same time issues for that same church regulation, because yes, this Bernard fought against heresies and so on, but at the same time the heretics were not reasoning in quite different ways when it came to what the church should be and how, in order to just criticize it and refute it and even invalidating it. And the Cistercian monastery was, in this sense, Bernard's model of life, right, in which basically was no indulgence for the earthly pleasures. Also, for example, the Cistercians, just like, we have seen the Cathars, were absolutely vegetarians, right? They were quite leashed to frequent fasting. They worked harshly and they prayed continuously, studying not the, as they call them, the vain sciences of the world, but just the scripture. On the long run, this model cannot work, right, in the world, or at least to win the world. Bernard's experience on this earth was seen as a continuous struggle, an ascesis, from in fact the Greek askesis, aimed at making so that the flesh would submit to the spirit. And he was thus founder of Western mysticism. To Bernard are owed very important developments in Marian theology, right? The role of the woman here was dramatically reappreciated and exalted and stressed, and that's a positive element. Albeit still, this was done in a mystical sense, so in a way that was not so different from those Chthonic, say, movements that were still, this you can exalt the woman and that's as such, but the contradiction is there. But what do if earthly, not earthly, just earthly pleasures, but earthly functions are not there, right? What is also the role, right, of men and women? So these were, in my opinion, some seeds of shortcoming that in fact the church at some point kind of rejected and passing to the side of, or the more say what the secular science offered in order to make sense of the world, also in a spiritual sense, which is a positive thing because they're not absolutely opposite at all, right? And as we were saying before, also Saint Bernard backed the birth of the Templar militia and what stemmed as emulation from it. And towards the end of the century, some elements of the same idea of Bernard were revived by the Calabrese monk Joachim of Fiore, founder of a community called thus Florensis on the Silla Mountains, quite wild and in fact it's the idea of the desertum. These are very cold, harsh, mountain areas. And who was the author of many works of mystical and apocalyptical nature, character, that were actually a commentary to the to the last book of the New Testament, the Apocalypse attributed to John. And there was all as you understand, an eschatological point here. It had also properly a prophetic character, from which it emerges a a complex vision of Joachim that is divided in three fundamentally, and reflected in the historical eras, right? Modeled on Trinity, of course, and so the first age is the one preceding the birth of Christ, is the one of the Father, so held by a very harsh law. So the Old Testament fundamentally, the law, Mosaic laws, and so on, and then the ones which the world is living, even according to Joachim, even though his apocalypse said something else in terms of timing. They were properly all on numerical symbolism, but that would be, in fact, the age of the church, the one of the Son, right, characterized by the gospel. And quite soon would have come the age of the Holy Ghost, the unique and perfect love would have been love. And this found all an application, because up to Joachimism was quite kind of borderline orthodox, right? It had a very, very heterodox character, and especially it was used, but it had a huge success in medieval Europe, because people believed fundamentally that, here you see, because of the charisma and authority attributed to such ascetic figure, that such prophecies would have been correct. And so this intertwined deeply with contemporary policy. They lived on up to the mid 13th century. They thought that Frederick II would have been the Antichrist, all these things. And people at the time believed in such things. They believed in such authorities. They believed in if you want, autonomously, in the idea that these people were authoritative. And this is what is fascinating about it, because the church, in a sense, actually became ever, as we're seeing here, ever more rational and ever more scientific in character. It didn't quite legitimately, like up to today, not really tolerate more than much this kind of autonomous pushes towards the idea of appearances and miracles and whatever. They want to see clearly what it is, because the risk of heterodoxy was always behind the corner, and it really was, and especially at the time. So it's very interesting actually to study these currents, because you see how deeply they intertwine sometimes at a level where they could, especially in these more retreated monastic communities, and these withdrawn monastic communities where you couldn't really control directly, that there could be some the flourishing of some heterodox ideas that could spread further. But we made a video about, I don't know, the Dulcinians or Segarellus, and you would, if we're not talking about the heresies broadly meant, that at that point were already put down largely, but they kept happening, right? So that was a constant threat that the church had to watch over, because of course it wasn't even just a theological issue, it was mainly a political one. These people were fundamentally anti-civilization. They were against the hierarchies, were against social order, political ordering was, they were often violent, and etc. Independently from the church propaganda instruments that were basically the same that the same heretics used, that were aimed, of course, with the same weapons at putting down such phenomena that otherwise would have compromised many situations. So this is interesting, because again, there was no firm control. So it's fascinating how in the Middle Ages they managed, after all, and succeeded in this enterprise. And so, in my opinion, that is impressive, and we should learn from it in terms of how do we cope with radical ideologies that do not actually fit the, could argue sometimes, properly mental health, but at a broader level, as a consequence, the political, social health and improvement, and whatever is what we have to do in order to bring a step forward. Again, this threat is necessary for that same advancement, because without that we couldn't ever recognize what's wrong, and so going in a different direction. But at the same time, we shouldn't, and this is the lesson, I guess, we should never think that we are immune from those, that being affected by such ideas is something that it doesn't happen to us, or that ideas that we think are kind of normal can simply they are because we own it, because it's fine, because everybody can think whatever the hell they want, and without any kind of responsibility even on the consequences of that or stuff. This is a very dangerous way of thinking, because it's, first of all, the easiest way to fall into it. First of all, if you come from such a background, it's because you don't have much of a structured scientific or moral system behind that. Because every time you are brought to cope with reality, you have to develop one. So if you don't, it's because there is something serious behind that in terms of self-accomplishment and achievements and actual, in fact, results on a real base, on a quantifiable, evident, kind of also civilizationally recognizable way by convention. And secondly, it's just a way to deceive yourself. Right, but what were after all these movements complaining about? Because that the fact that, again, the church was corrupted, that's a good reason to fix it, right? But how do you fix it? You see, by extremizing the thing in a utopistic direction. So basically tearing down all what is trying to be done in order to manage reality in a way that at least you can make a sensible, measurable difference in terms, for example, political and social order and pacification, and as fundamental basis for expansion and further prosperity. I mean, no wonder that these elements essentially lost on the longer run. And this is interesting because, you see, it's not just about the heresies coming back in the moment in which European civilization came back after this contraction of the early Middle Ages and re-expanded. And so obviously it was a larger system that had to be controlled, but it's about the re-emergence of those fatalistic attitudes that weren't about, you see, this escape from the world. Basically says, as these movements did, I accept the order as it is. We may never fully know how much the church was accepted in this regard, in its totality, at which point, right, in which belief. And that's why the 12th century was also so dangerously heretical in nature. But it's fatalistic in nature to pretend, okay, let's simply let everybody do what, let's simply make things happen without any concern about that. Let's extraneate ourselves from the world, so that, from our side, we just show that we don't take any other choice but, doing things that, yes, may be productive, fortunately, and that was the good side of it, like working, right? But even in there, working without enriching yourself or developing, it cannot happen. And secondly, in fact, this constant idea of fasting, of, fleeing any kind of earthly dimension, the idea of mortifying the body, the spirit, these were things, in fact, were in part shared the same heretical movements, and this kind of Platonic Dionysian dimension, also the revival of the female figure here is quite double-edged, because from one side it was positive in the secular celebration of the woman, that surely was, that earned here. There is a humanistic principle. You see, the 12th century is it's called, kind of a sort of the first humanistic phase that happened, and we know how much the beauty of Western civilization owes to Marian representation, and the Virgin with her child and so on, which is a real woman, right? And so the symbol of all women. So the fact that she's a virgin in that case, it's not like it's the paradox. It's the idea that there is an inherent femininity that cannot be taken away in potential from even probably the miraculous realization of salvation. And still it comes with a huge burden that Mary knew about, of course, of her son being sacrificed for the sins of humanity. So it's an enormous scientific, moral, civilizational understanding, right? It's all what anthropology, neuropsychology, evolution is coming back prepotently with, because they got it that it was completely spot on, right? From the other side, however, you had, a principle of femininity abstractly meant that is mostly, as opposed to the, in fact, the hierarchical one, as a chaotic one. And that's fundamentally what the heresies was pushing for, was not, yes, also in there, the heresies were human, and so the Cathars were creating a perfectly parallel system to the Roman Church, including with the Inquisition, repression, all these things. So, but at least the mystical idea of it, that was dramatically imbalanced in favor of chaos, of a rejection of authority. So that's not a positive thing, because civilization is based on hierarchies, on authority, on order, on discipline. And it turns out there is nothing, in the opposite direction that, aside from an obvious, resistance from our biological limits, that of course are the ones can be also of a psychophysically exhausted person can bear. So it's meaningful in this regard that the Cistercians, for example, worked that hard, and still they exhausted themselves in the process without even eating enough, or at least they coped with this in different ways, and it wasn't so radical, in fact. But that represents a good example of this, because it was really both things. It wasn't just an ascetical thing, and consequently also, if it's not just about ascesis, about literally pure fatalism, chaos, and okay, I'll simply die. That would have been Catharism in a nutshell. I have to work, I have to do something, I have to achieve something. That obviously leads towards organization, towards hierarchy, towards authority, and so that's it. There's no way out of that, right? So it's not surprising that this situation was so still by the 12th century, and that the 13th would bring to the triumph of the church as a, again, scientifically, rationally based system by doctrine, as the large Orthodox majority managing to regulate this mess that Europe was, in the sense of political fragmentation. Nobody had where there factually was no order, and that had to be built from scratch from the bottom, and they succeeded in doing it. So to me, it's extremely relevant, and the more I study even these ecclesiological matters, and the more I realize what an incredible achievement the papal curia scored. It's impressive. It's beyond words, right? And yet these movements serve the purpose as well, because they sustained, in that sense, that also that the risk that things could go in a different way too, and so for maintaining the debate alive and not just being sclerotized in orthodoxy without any challenge because of that. And for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.